Hey, all you Ethicuties and the 40% of you who have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse, welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. It's your boy. I'm back, Nicky Newneck. Look at this. Look at this range of motion. Can you imagine? Look at that. So I'm back. No neck brace. I am. Christmas came early. So today we got a great treat for you. Cultural risk signals, lessons from audit and investigations with the one and only Julio Rivera. As I run through my quick announcements here, remember what we say every week. Your network is your net worth. Neither are big enough. So get both of those bigger, drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat and connect with at least one person. I was at another conference last week and, I've been on the road the last couple of weeks. And last week, even more people were talking about the Ethicsverse. So this is our place to join together every Thursday at noon to connect, to learn, to sharpen our sword, to connect with each other, to share what we're going through. You have to take advantage of this asset that we have. You know, this is the most collaborative industry that I've ever been a part of, that I've ever seen, and it can be such a superpower for us. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Remember, you get no bonus points in life for reinventing the wheel. So drop that LinkedIn URL in the chat, and we will get moving here. Podcast, books, I love pumping the podcast. The Unless podcast by Hema Lomax is really cool. If you don't know Hema, get to know her, follow her on LinkedIn for sure. Check her out on the Great Women in Compliance podcast. The Unless podcast is her new podcast, and she's bringing on all these really cool, interesting guests that have some really cool insights for our lives. So hit this QR code. The fastest growing ethics and compliance podcast in the world is the Ethicsverse. So we had Emily Frank on. We're launching our new season here. So you're gonna see a lot more Ethicsverse in 2025. But if you haven't checked it out, I encourage you to do it. Like everything we do at Ethico, we want to really add value. You're not going to see any thinly veiled sales presentations with us. We want to have interesting conversations to help us practitioners in the space do our jobs better, drive our cultures of integrity forward, and magnify our impact. Speaking of magnifying our impact, it's hard to magnify your impact if you have not actualized the middle managers in your organization. I've been talking a lot about this ECI presentation. I was at a couple of weeks ago. And the number one blocker for driving this culture of integrity forward is activating middle managers. People are 6 to 8 times more likely to come to a middle manager with some kind of a complaint versus the anonymous channel that you have in place. So take a look at this middle manager toolkit. We're at 400 emojis so far. We're trying to break a new record today. This is the last one before Christmas, so everyone's fingers should be dancing on those emojis. Take a look at this middle manager toolkit. This has gotten a ton of great feedback. There's a great white paper in there and a bunch of great assets that you can literally take off the shelves, drop your logo on, and start utilizing. Anytime we talk about culture champions, compliance champions, the thing that I usually hear after those presentations is, wow, this is great. Where do I start? Well, this is where you start, and this is free. So check that out. Also, round of applause. Congratulations to all the Conversant clients. You guys just got sold again to a German company called EQS. So that should be really exciting. The Ethico ecosystem is your answer for, the ills. I've just been handed a bulletin. You have something in your front teeth. Just kidding. Here's some feedback from somebody who just came over from a competitor. Before we moved to Ethico, our cases were aged over 30 days. Now, 2 months in, we are closing cases in 3 to 4 days. We're getting better info for our investigators, and the tool has cut out so many manual steps. We also received this feedback last week. A person taking this is from somebody who called this company. A person taking my call really made me feel my concern was heard. They really seemed to care about what I was calling about. How can we activate the human sensors in our organization if they are feeling rushed off the phone, if they're answering 6 questions and hung up on? So it all starts with our intake. It all starts with great service, and it all starts with us magnifying our impact and activating those human sensors in our organization. Hard for us to show our impact when we're running in the mud. So if you're interested in seeing what else is out there, if you don't want to move to a new private equity-backed German company, we have this phenomenal promised land promotion. So if you feel like the love is lost, if you feel like your analytics aren't where they need to be, if you feel like you're having misses with your outsourced vendor, it might be time to see if that status quo is going to be worthwhile. So we have this promotion going for anybody coming from Navex, Conversant, OneTrust, or now EQS. You can come on over for a 15% discount and up to a year free. So see what everybody is talking about and check out Ethico. We're giving away some books today. Because I love you, we're giving away this Modern Achievement book. Of course, you get to pick from any of the books in the Ethico library, but this is the one that we're promoting right now by Marshall Goldsmith and Ashleen. So drop your comments in the chat, drop your tips in the chat as we dive in here. I'm Nick. How's it going? This is me in my sort of cosmic sort of, I don't know, sorcerer type of look. And here is the one and only Julio Rivera. He is the founder of QMS Nexus. It's a boutique consulting firm dedicated to accelerating compliance and business strategy through integrative compliance solutions. So Julio is a friend of the show. He's got a lot of great insights for us. We have a lot to cover today. So like I said, keep those questions coming. We'll try to work those in. But Julio, why don't we dive right into the presentation and start talking about our agenda and takeaways? We're up to 17,000 emojis. I love it.
Oh, that's great. I love your excitement. Thanks for having me online. I've been following you for a while, not as a stalker. I just love your show, what you do for the community. Honestly, I've met some great people that have reached out to me, and it's pretty inspiring and trying to help me in certain areas. It's uncanny. I'm not used to that kind of
I love it.
engagement, so it's really good stuff. So the agenda, is gonna it kind of changed a little bit because of some of the last webinar that you had, and it was talking about DOJ and patterns. So this is kind of a natural build into those areas. It's a little bit more granular about how to using some of the audit experiences that I have. So it really tightly bridges that. Hopefully this will spur some thought processes of different ways to attack that same DOJ expectations. I think we'll give you enough of examples that hopefully that will do that. So as far as we're hoping we'll get a little poll question to get an understanding where people sit right now. We're as far as my background, I've been doing this type of audit. I call them integrative audits, but I've been doing it for probably about 15 years for high stakes things. Things, Nick, like due diligence. If a company wants to buy, for example, an acquisition and they're going to spend $500 million on an asset, because that's going to be the next breakthrough in the world that I lived in, right? Yep. And it's about making you in those spaces, you have very little time to make those kind of decisions, and using this process that we're going to be talking about, even at that high level, it really focuses your attention to the most meaningful, not the trivial. Because when you engage in those areas, it's very easy to look for that shiny object, and this really puts you on point so your company can make those kind of decisions. Done a lot of remediation work, sites that are close to remediation, whether the government puts them on remediation or the internal government wants to improve, the governance wants to improve things. We're talking about signals, that come from various ranges. You just got to be very tuned to that. So I'm going to share some actual practical examples of what that might look like from an audit perspective. They get very pronounced in that area. And then we're going to talk about qualitative versus quantitative risk and risk maturity. In a nutshell, qualitative is more of a judgment call, very subjective, where you're, in most industries, you're moving towards quantitative. And I think DOJ is doing the same thing right now. They're asking for the quality of data that you're providing. They're trying to stay away from that opinion-based. We'll talk a little bit about DOJ expectations. I looked at the requirements, the pillars, if you will, and I noticed that the profiling of the risk of the organization is critical, including the third parties you deal with. Program design is really important for them, and then let's go on to the next point. The monitoring tools, right? After you have this process in place and you've done the profiling, it's about the monitoring. So what does that look like? So we're going to go into like one or two examples and kind of, a lot of these things are going to overlap between risk management, audits, and risk and compliance and ethics. They kind of all blend together, and they all together give you a very good picture, more than just one dot, if you will, on the board. So this is kind of depicting that operating in silos for areas of significance. So when I worked in silos, and I worked in internal audit for a brief period of time, and you saw the big picture, but you didn't see what was really going on the ground. Not a very accurate picture. And then you do the operational audits, and that gives you a picture too. But often the main issues in these high risk areas are upstream, right? You look at the TD Bank and the Boeing. Those decisions weren't made at an operational level. That's just where they showed their symptoms. So the point here is when you're only looking at a piece of the puzzle, if you will, it's very hard to see that elephant, and that elephant may be there very vividly. And we'll go through some examples. The destination here is really about creating predictability, right? Looking forward versus in the rear view mirror, which is the traditional compliance evaluation. It focuses you on the most meaningful. And then really for me, the most important thing is really drives business value. You're really trying to align the business to what you're doing, proactive and efficient. It helps organizations really flip the switch and move from reactive to more proactive activities and their resources. And the beauty that I am passionate about in this area is how many ahas people get, right? They didn't see something because they only had one piece of the puzzle. Now you're sharing something more depth and they're like, wow, it was right in front of me. Never saw it, because you've been living with that for so long. You no longer see the anomalies, right? So bringing that insight adds a lot of value.
Yeah, I mean, we can't do our job. We can't be a fully functioning compliance function if we're not the circulatory system of the organization. I mean, think about what happens to the body when the circulatory system is cut off from your hand or from a different organ. Like, those organs die, those parts of the body die. And if you're siloed off, or you don't see what's going on, and you can't bring those nutrients or bring those insights across organs, then, the thing's not going to function the way that it should. So it's super critical. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Nick. I mean, that's the analogy I was going to use. Very similar to that.
See, well, remember, anything in our pre-show notes is fair game. So there's a lot of things that you're planning to say that I will be saying.
Yeah. So it's amazing, but it's very practical. People who are sick and they wind up, they don't know what the problem is. They go through 30 different doctors and they don't talk to each other. And nobody puts that pieces together, what it really means, right? So it's exciting when you actually were able to put all that together, create a hypothesis. The doctor now sees you and has all that background, and they have a prognosis, and limited testing. So they're going to narrow down. That's kind of what this does as well. So I appreciate that analogy.
I want to do a quick round of applause for David. He's on vacation in France and he's joining the Ethicsverse. See, I love it. David, hope you're having a great time. Let me know if you need my t-shirt size. I'm sure if you eyeball it, it'll be fine. All right, please keep going here. Let's dive into these this predictability axiom.
So the framework that the picture's trying to depict, it's a little bit of a busy slide, but you'll see that there's a satellite. That's for the strategic view that you're trying to get when you're evaluating your systems or your investigations. You're trying to understand what those mandates are. We'll go into a little more detail later. And then you're trying to get the operational on the ground view. And then you have the micro view, right? The detailed stuff that you're going to look at. And then, looking at what's most important. In the healthcare industry, it's about the patient, right? At the end of the day, that's your North Star, and putting all those pieces together and analyzing that. So again, that's the internal audit, that's the operational data audit. In my world, I was part of a function that we would do risk audits just to evaluate the maturity of how you were handling risks. Were you reactive, proactive? Did you contain that issue? Were you looking in the right directions and judging that? Because that creates resilience. If you have a very good risk and maturity of a risk program, the organization looks very much different. They're focusing on growing their business, improving, creating efficiencies, where the reactive ones, they're kind of in firefighting mode. And you see that as an auditor, all the symptoms are there.
So, I'm kind of fascinated by this concept of like fragility. And I think as a system gets bigger, it's harder for the apparatus, the risk management apparatus that we put in place, that sort of crystalline structure, it's harder for that to change and adapt. So as the business changes or as the industry changes, it's harder for that structure to keep up. So most systems, most technologies, most things that we invent or rely on are highly fragile things. They're things that when stress is applied to those systems, those things perform less well. One of the most interesting, antitheses of fragility is this concept of anti-fragility, where stress applied to the system makes that system stronger. And, the best example I have of like an anti-fragile system is like the human body or a tree or like something natural. Natural systems tend to be kind of anti-fragile because they have that built-in adaptability. So again, how can we do our job if we don't have those human sensors activated and being part of this risk management apparatus? When they're turned on, the level of fragility of what we're relying on to mitigate risk and to gain insights falls through the floor. When they're not turned on, you now have a highly fragile system that has increasingly lower predictability as you get away from, as you kind of move through time away from the creation of that system, right? Like that creation is something that's sort of stagnated. It's something that's like put into place given a sort of certain set of circumstances. So we spend a lot of time in the Ethicsverse talking about how do we activate the human sensors in the organization? How do we crowdsource this risk intelligence? This is just another kind of example of the importance of that, because without it, you're really going to be flying blind before you know it.
It's almost like the immune system. If you have a very good immune system, you can fight off those stressors that come into the organization.
Just right, and your immunity goes up from those stressors, right? Like
it really does.
The stressors strengthen that system. That's the type of ideal I think we should be trying to create and trying to strive for. And I just think it's impossible to do that if the human beings, the people, are not an active participant in that system.
Yeah, and one of the organizations that I worked with, that was their main thing. We did not do operational audits. We did not do the governance audits. We did risk assessments because we wanted to drive that culture and that behavior where people know, hey, I can take a risk, but there are boundaries, right? And it made the organizations a lot more resilient to be able to take a lot of change. And those were successes in those spaces doing that. Now, it's interesting that in these high stakes kind of assessments that culture is such a canary in the coal mine. It rings loud, like if you're attuned to that, you can see all the symptoms before you even get on the ground, how people behave and misbehaviors and actions that they've taken, and those are very clear. They kind of go hand in hand. So you get the strategic overview of risk, and then you get the operational, and then the people actually will provide a little bit more detail on that. So I kind of have, this is a combination of what does it really look like, right? We can talk theoretical. So in any of, these high stakes, mediations or consent decrees, which I've, been part of quite a few, or recall situations, and they asked me to go, in the past I've been asked by multinationals to go and evaluate, hey, is this ring fence? Is this it? Is this as bad as it's going to get? And usually going to have a lot of signals. And the movie with Bruce Willis, about the young boy that can see dead bodies, he sees them, and he says, are you seeing them now? And he says, I see them everywhere. Nobody else sees them, but he sees them everywhere. And the signals are there if you're attuned to pick those up, and it kind of helps you focus on the right thing. So from a strategic evaluation, and then from a business strategy, I can tell you that, in many cases that I've looked at, when something went wrong and then something was drastic and it was going on for a while, that the underlying cause was the business strategy that somebody had, the risk gap, they wanted to grow their business to this level and they wanted to really speed it up. And then the control level that they had was down here, and they were cutting that. So there's a lot of space for that risk appetite, if you will. Now, ideally, you want to, make that a little bit of a smaller of a space, between those two. And then, KPIs often, sadly, they often drive wrong behavior. They're telling, you cut people and you say, we're going to be more efficient. We're going to give you half the people that you need. People are eventually going to be forced to take shortcuts. That's a leading indicator of that I look for in an audit. Things are look too good, or they look too bad. If they look too good, I could tell you, the KPIs are wrong because they're driving often the wrong behavior, and it's very rare to see that the KPIs actually reflect what you see on the ground. From an operational review perspective, the case studies that I've seen, very ugly ones. The organization, looking at the organization makes a really big difference. What's the head count compared to what they should in the industry? Who are they reporting to? Is the fox, guarding the hen house? Sometimes there's conflict of interest. Who reports to whom? And then the high turnover in those really critical spots that are making those decisions when nobody's watching, so to speak, is a big deal. You see behaviors, things of people trying to cut down the time. An audit is a window, and they're trying to narrow it down. So it's only a peephole. The documents that you should get, it's very classic that suddenly can't be found, they're not available. personnel. Sometimes, Nick, people will, there's always people who want to do the right thing. I've had people reach out to me in a hotel before an audit and, or pull me in the bathroom and say, hey, can you look at this? Can you look at that? A wink and a nod. People want to do the right thing, when the opportunity comes up. So those events happen in those incidents uncannily, often. You have to be a little creative, look outside the traditional boxes. Sometimes the information I've had, and I'm not a ethics person, but sometimes the signals are very loud from an HR perspective, investigations. And in some countries, let's just say they are a little bit more looser about what they can tell you. And you can see that the culture, there was punishment for that person doing X, Y, and Z thing.
Right.
Right.
So Julio,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. We're having some problems with your screen. We're just looking at a black screen. So maybe you want to hit the connected button at the top and make sure you're connected, or get out and get back in. But I think the point here is that there are early indicators that there might be an issue, and we can see those kind of all over the place if we're willing to open our eyes. We can see the dead people around us if we open our eyes, like Haley Joel Osment, one of my all-time faves. So those are going to be early indicators on like rocks you might want to look under to see what might be a systemic problem that you can fix. Usually this is a bouquet of issues that are rooted down into some certain behaviors or some kind of catalyzing event. And so you can help kind of see around the curve in your organization to the extent that some of these things might be coming up. If there's a big change happening, there's an acquisition happening, you're going into a new market, there's a big personnel change. Like Julio was saying, when you start to ask those questions, you get vague answers and so forth. Those are likely situations where there is going to be some risk and some issues. We got a great question here, though. I'd love you to weigh in on, Julio, as you work on your camera. From the one and only Dr. Robin Y. Green. How's it going, Dr. Green? Where was that question? I got to find it. I'm sorry. I just scrolled up. There's too many questions. Oh, here it is. Perception is reality. How do you account for the implication of the business culture on risk identification and mitigation? What a great question.
Let me make sure I understand that question. Could you repeat that, please?
How do you account for the implications on the business culture of, how do you account for the implications of the business culture on risk identification and mitigation? For example, perhaps you're in a, I'm just kind of inferring here, but perhaps you're in a startup that's a fast moving kind of move fast and break things type of culture. How do you avoid sort of like getting the wrong signals from that type of a culture in the context of that strategy that's being pursued?
And we're going to get into that in a little detail, but the summary of it is, when I evaluate a site that's in trouble or a due diligence, we're looking for the business strategy, right? How are they managing those risks? And who owns that? Is it writing? Do they acknowledge those risks? Do they have a control strategy and a monitoring strategy to make sure that risk isn't going to get out of hand, so to speak? So
hey, Julio, real quick, just click your camera button so that the camera on the console, and we'll just shut your camera off since you're having problems.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to dive in now to DOJ profiling and quantifying. And this is that kind of risk maturity question. DOJ is talking about it moving from this sort of qualified, qualitative risk, question to something that's more quantifying. So let's dive into this risk maturity framework.
Yeah, so DOJ, there's three pillars that they're asking for, right? It's the corporation's compliance program well designed. In our world, in the pharma world, it's QMS, design, preventing and detecting is their focus for DOJ, as well as is the program being applied. In our world, we would call that, is it in use? Okay, it's great that you have a policy and a procedure, but are you actually using it? Sometimes it's just a bookmarker somewhere. And then the next piece is, does the corporation work in practice? Is it actually effective? Is it actually being applied across the organization? There's indicators of that. And then the fourth piece is the corporation's compliance program adequately resourced. So in my world, that's a common big observation that they'll say, okay, you're people were not authorized to execute their responsibilities. You didn't have enough resources to make sure that they were preventing these significant issues. So that's a significant violation in that space. So that's what they're saying that here as well. And then the key point is data analysis accuracy. And in my space, it's critical that what you're looking at is not subjective. That it's actually, if I showed it to 10 people, they can come up with the same conclusion. So data accuracy and availability and reliability, and that it can actually be used to recreate the whole event that might have happened is very critical. And it's obviously for DOJ is very critical as well, right? So these are the tenets of what, in essence, what DOJ is asking for.
So how can you use this list of things that DOJ is asking for to get more of what you need? I think there's a lot of like persuasive power. There's a lot of persuasive fodder in this list. And I think, so much of our job is influencing, and so much of influencing is kind of, contingent on like how you frame stuff. So how can you frame out this guidance to get what you need? So you could say something like, I'm not looking for a Corvette. I'm not looking for a Lamborghini sort of best in class program. I just need a Honda. I can sell that a Honda is, an adequately resourced program, but right now I'm on a bicycle. So framing it out that kind of way and leveraging this guidance that's coming from DOJ, which is not going away anytime soon, can be a catalyst and be a point of leverage for you to get more of what you want. Again, we have to have this high agency approach to our job. We have to have this high agency approach in pursuit of this vision we have for the culture of integrity that we're trying to build. We can't just sort of sit in the passenger seat and hope that the car of business, the car of your organization drives you to the right destination. You got to grab that steering wheel. And I think that takes us acting in a different way, us saying things differently, us framing things differently than we may have in the past. But I think when we start to open our eyes, you start to see around you all of these opportunities, all these anecdotes, all these stories, all these pieces of guidance that you can start to, filter into your internal conversations to get the extra budget that you need to not just to preserve your job, but to do the job that you're mandated to do. All right, so let's talk about leading indicators of risk and how that can lead to some predictability.
So we talked a little bit about risk maturity. What does it look like, right? So from an audit perspective, when I'm evaluating something, the typical things, the verbal cues, the cultural signs, if you will, is you're going to hear a lot of, discussion or documents that say, that feels like, I think, I like, I believe. It'll say things like, well, we never had that issue before. Why are we worried about that, right? We've always done it this way. Those are clear indicators that things are very subjective, and the documents will reflect that as well. Now, on the other side, what maturity looks like, and enterprise maturity would look like from a risk perspective, is when people are actually, when they respond to you and they'll say, the reason I think this is low risk is because we have this process capability statistical analysis that tells us the probability of this occurring is low. And the data that we have says that this hasn't occurred under these conditions. Industry knowledge tells us this. You're actually using data and analysis, kind of like what the DOJ is suggesting as well, that you have rely on data and that it be reliable, right? Versus the subjective opinion. So that's the key picture that I'm trying to portray here. And almost anything can be measured, right? And can be analyzed, and you can almost predict. If you have a deviations, 3 a month, and all of a sudden, or investigations, and suddenly you get 30. That's a telltale sign that something's going wrong. So if you use those metrics to give you a trigger point, it's going to tell you that something anomalous may be going on wrong.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, again, for those of us who are worried about how do we prove effectiveness, we have to be looking for metrics that are closer to our sort of like sphere of influence and sphere of control. Like the closer those are to your ability to like affect it, I think the better. And many of the compliance metrics are kind of, what I call slow metrics. They're lagging indicators of something happening. And sometimes they're second and third order impacts that are a little bit more outside of our control than like what we're touching directly. So we were talking about this at a recent conference with respect to like, how do you prove the effectiveness of your investigation program? So what most of us have historically looked at is substantiation rate, right? That's kind of the end of the investigation. How many substantiated issues are we looking at? That's just kind of a major KPI that like people tend to look at. The problem with that metric though is that it's a very slow indicator, first of all, and second of all, you can't really do a lot to affect that in the short term. So I can't, and you also can't necessarily say that, hey, my substantiation rate is going up, thus my program is more effective. That's a little bit harder of an argument to make. So what we're seeing people do is they're moving toward creation of a new metric to say what proportion of my cases have a corrective action attached to it. So in our tool, you can attach a corrective action to the back end of any investigation, because many times the end of an investigation is not the end of something; it's the start of something. It opens a new loop that needs to be closed. And so now I have a metric that's closer to my actual efforts that I can point to over time to say, it used to only be 20% of our cases had corrective action plans attached to them. Now we're up to 40%. So that is a direct mitigation of risk. That's something that's way closer to something that we can control, and that's something that it's easier to frame out like a proof of effectiveness by using a metric like that versus something like more calls or something like that. So again, how do we move toward the peace of mind? Again, we're not doing this to try to appease DOJ. We're moving toward the peace of mind for ourselves that our programs are becoming more effective, and we can kind of air out and like burn off some of that sort of latent anxiety that comes from relying solely on like lagging indicators, many of which, due to like analytics or whatever, take a month or a quarter before you even put eyes on them.
Yeah, and to add to that point, Nick, I mean, common practices for leading companies that I've audited, whether the pharmaceutical, medical devices, or the vast amount of suppliers, they extend even beyond that. They'll look for leading indicators that, for example, common root causes, common system issues, and they'll actually trend those things out and see if they're actually required to see if those CAPAs are actually effective. Right. And they'll trend that out. They'll say, hey, in 6 months, we're going to evaluate what the rate is of these type of complaints, these type of causes, and see if it's actually diminishing. And if they don't, they go back to the drawing board and they reevaluate that again. So it's a continuous loop to prove that what you're doing is actually effective. So there's some really good practices we'll touch upon in a minute or two.
Yeah, I just want to call out, Kelly has such an amazing eye. She was probably good at that I Spy game. The lady in the middle of the slide has her legs on backwards, and now no one can stop seeing it. Good eye, Kelly. All right, let's jump to the next slide here. All right, so we're talking now about immature risk management as the underlying factor to adverse compliance patterns. Many times, adverse compliance patterns are rooted down in immature risk management, whether that's inactivation of human sensors, whether it's a lack of guidance, a lack of policies. So let's walk through these 4 factors, Julio.
Okay. Yeah. So I look at, when I'm looking at from a risk perspective of what is the underlying cause of why this particular incident occurred, they fall into these 4 buckets. The first one being, the process is not capable of detecting patterns or early signals. That's a gap, right? The second one would be the risk appetite. So at the very high level, they either have a very high risk appetite and inadequate controls, or it's not very well defined. So the organization, you'll see vast differences in controls. Like I've, audited, for example, 3 or 4 different the same organization, 3 or 4 different sites, and you see a wide swing of controls. And you ask the question, so do you guys have a policy or procedure that connects all these things together? And often the answer is no. And that's why they have the unpredictable, wide swing of variability. That's the risk appetite, that's set at the top. And that's usually written in some written form about what's acceptable and what's not. Risk assessment, that is, you get a new you get a new regulation that comes in, a new expectation, and your risk assessment, and the people who are doing that misinterpret that. Sometimes there's a lot of bias, right? Lack of knowledge, what that should look like. They're downplayed. Or in many cases, they're circumvented because there's a reward, right? There's a promotion, if you will, for taking that lower road. So that is the fundamental piece that assessment hasn't been done adequately. It's subjective. And then the next piece is, this is very typical. Risk assessment is considered like a one-time event. So maybe 10 years ago, what you're doing was perfect, but you haven't gone back to see if it's gotten worse or if it's gotten better. So maybe you can adjust those resources. It really can help the business because often the risk is diminished and you're applying that big gigantic hammer to an ant, and you don't need to do that. You can use those resources and put them somewhere else.
Somebody in the chat, I had this and I kind of lost it, but it was something, they said something like, monitoring is like the bane of my existence. I always feel like I'm bothering people too much. How do you, what would you say? Yeah, monitoring is my kryptonite. I feel like I'm stepping on toes. So that was from Alyssa. Thank you, Alyssa, for that comment. So like, what would you say to Alyssa, or for those of us who have that same kind of a feeling with respect to monitoring, because it's such a critical thing, right? Like this is rarely a set it and risk management is rarely a set it and forget it situation.
I think the challenge here, and I've seen this unfortunately quite often, that an organization comes up with 1,000 KPIs and these people are overwhelmed and 999 aren't providing any value. It's demonstrating that the KPIs and the monitoring that you're doing is actually adding value. And what does that mean, adding value? That you can actually back off the controls. Once you get to the controls, you can say, we've monitored so much that we realize that we went overboard and we can actually back off a little bit, right? So you're giving the business a little bit more latitude when they need it. And when they don't, you're increasing, right? Based on that. So it has to go both ways. Unfortunately, from a compliance perspective, often we monitor and we see there's no value in that monitoring and people jumping through hoops and they start resenting that. So we need to be very practical of what we ask for.
So I think that answer's great. So good job. 100 points awarded to you. But Michelle, it leads well into this next question from Michelle, where she said, how do you get your culture / workforce to buy into the value of this? And I think you kind of touched on something where, there needs to be some kind of common sense application here. We need to not be asking people to jump through hoops unnecessarily. But back to framing, back to influence, back to sort of selling. How do you, what advice would you give Michelle or those of us listening? Like, how do we best sell this stuff to the organization, whose participation we need in order to get the outputs that are necessary for us to do our job?
I'll give you one of many examples. When I know that I'm going to see a lot of resistance, you can kind of tell by the work that you do that there's going to be a lot of resistance, going to be a lot of flack. What I try to do in the background before I even start the assessment, I try to quantify what is the cost of these doing wrong. So if I see a product was taken off the market and it cost them $5 million, or people are working overtime and they're killing themselves because they're not being effective or efficient in that area, I try to bring that number to the plate and I'll say, did you know that these investigations, take 40 man hours and you're paying X amount of dollars and you got people working overtime, and over the year it's costing you $10 million. And I've seen that number used. And I said, if you change this, you wouldn't have to work the weekends. You wouldn't have to be struggling and stressing out your people as much, right? And you'd be able to prioritize. That's the sell. And often, Nick, I've seen people just like look at me like, I said, you don't need all those extra resources. You just need to stop that waste that you're doing downstream. And that's a very big sell. It really changes people's perspective. If you bring them, that's in our world, we call that lean sigma, trying to remove the waste, right?
Yep. I think, it's an influence game. You said, you have to sell it. I think that's right. I think every lock can always be picked. Everybody can be convinced, assuming it's a good idea. If it's actually a good idea, everybody can be convinced. So I think the key is kind of putting it in terms that resonate with them. So that might be tying it to an existing value inside your organization, an explicit or implicit value. Every organization is concerned about quality. Well, compliance is quality. So saying that, hey, we're trying to build a highly compliant organization, not for the sake of compliance, but so that we can run down the road of commerce faster. I'm trying to free you up to be able to run faster and not have to worry about these other things. Tying it to something that resonates with them, whether it's time savings for the job that they're doing, worry that they might have, an ability for them to, have more impact, make more money, whatever. There's always a way to kind of reframe it. And Tiffany kind of asked, how do you create buy-in to compliance issues that have an extremely small likelihood of lawsuit? Like an extremely low likelihood. So we're getting into some nuance here. but I think we're getting some really good questions. We got one coming from France even, I think, here. But like, how do we deal with that? How do we frame out appropriately things that have a really low risk, or something that there's a risk, assessing the risk, like there's some asymmetry. We think as compliance folks, it's a bigger risk than the salesperson who's been doing business in the Middle East for years. Like, how do we frame that out in the right way for it not to feel like, burdensome?
I think that's the challenge from a compliance perspective and quality perspective. We always want perfection in some ways, right? And we need to see what the reward is for the culture and the business and the compliance risk. And if the risk is so minor, you may want to adjust that standard. And I've seen that quite a few times where people are struggling, and I'm like, why are you spending all this time and all this resources for something that is so minor? The effect that happens is so minor. Why would you put this level of effort? Do you not have something that's more important, more critical, that you can dedicate your resources to that? Still monitor that, right? See if it's getting worse. But if the impact that we're going to talk about a little bit and how that how you evaluate that, sometimes you have to back off, right? Because the risk may be, and I've seen it, Nick, where an executive thought this was a humongous risk. They guesstimated it. And then years later, you find out it really wasn't. We were killing that ant with that big, gigantic bulldozer, if you will, that big, gigantic hammer. And it wasn't necessary. And we have to make that call. Is the benefit of what we're asking for, and the risk, is it really worth it?
But there's this concept in persuasion called an accusation audit. So this is where you're, remember in the end of 8 Mile, where Eminem says all the things that the guy was about to say about him, and that took all the wind out of that guy's sails. Great Christmas movie, by the way. I think if you can do an accusation audit with this kind of a concept and say, listen, I am not trying to crush an ant with a bulldozer. That's not the kind of compliance program I want to be. I want to make sure that we're putting, appropriate controls in place for risks that could be reasonably detrimental to us. I think just kind of calling that out when we're faced with people that typically, or maybe sometimes, have like a negative perception of us, or that we're the office of no, or we're the anti-business function, all those kinds of things. I think calling that out up front and saying, I'm not that. That does a lot to help reframe who you are in that role. And again, you have to pick that lock. You may have inherited a program from somebody that didn't get it and really was kind of foot off the gas for the last couple of innings of their career, and they were really just trying to keep their job. Well, if you're stepping into a kind of mess, it's on you to undo whatever branding problem is attached to your particular department in your organization, and that accusation audit can be extremely powerful. One other question. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No,
that's such a powerful statement to getting trust for people. I've been in situations where, I thought that something was, very serious. I misunderstood it. Okay. Mm-hmm. And you have to be man enough, if you will, just to realize, hey, can we revisit that? I've done that. And I'm like, maybe I got this wrong. Maybe I misunderstood you. And they come back and they give you the information and they're like, you got it right. You're doing it in a different way than I expected. And I think what you're doing is actually pretty good. And people will give me accolades after the fact saying, we've never had a compliance person come back and say, we got it wrong. You're doing well enough.
Think about this. You can never let's just say it this way. If you feel like you can persuade me, you can change my mind about something, you are also disproportionately more open to me changing your mind. So when we as compliance folks can raise our hand and say, hey, we looked at that wrong, or hey, you're doing that the right way, you have effectively sort of changed my mind on how, I was looking at it one way, I really need to look at it this way. That builds a lot of trust, because it shows that hey, I'm not just about my own agenda. I'm trying to get to the right answer, and I'm open to it not being what I'm talking about. So these are some of these subversive, maybe that's the wrong word, but kind of below the radar subconscious communications that can really allow us to build trust in a much faster way than taking kind of the 3 turns around the block. I got one other question here from Eric. He's asking for a friend. How nice of this guy. He's just so caring. He said, speaking of Flack, how do you change the culture from viewing risk, compliance, ethics team as the company's internal affairs? So again, this is part of that reframe, but internal affairs is in a police department or something, right? So how do you view, which is kind of antagonistic to the rest of the department? How do we reframe away this sort of perceived antagonism that will come from our department?
For me, I think the antagonism is sometimes having them engaged in the risk evaluation of what the worst thing that could happen, what the probabilities are, what the learnings have been across the organization, right? It's really important to help people understand the why you're doing it.
Yeah.
And it should be justified, right? And again, you have to be open enough that, maybe those rules were in place for a reason 30 years ago and it made sense and now it doesn't. So have them be part of that assessment and say, this is what we know. And again, if they provide you new information that says that's no longer true, you need to be flexible enough. So, and if they can't, people will say, and they won't tell you, aha, I get it now, because I've had that same situation. They're like, you're crushing us, blah, blah, blah. And then a year later, they're like, everything you said was so true. We didn't see it at the time. Oh my God, our business is doing great because of this. We no longer have all these obstacles. So getting those stakeholders involved and making those evaluations is really important, because they're the voice that are going to be spreading that compliance is really working with us, right? And they understand where we're coming from.
Yeah, and I think it's on us to toot our own horn to some degree, right? Like if my daughter does well in a spelling test and she comes up and shows me how great she did, well, she's going to get some accolades from me, and that's going to remind me that, like, oh wow, what a great kid she is, and all that kind of stuff. Like there's a ton of good things that we are doing inside of our departments and inside of our functions. We have to figure out a way to get credit for that if we're ever going to reframe with actual data or with actual experiences, if we're ever going to reframe this view that others might have of us. So I just think it takes some intentionality and it takes some work and be looking. But again, like if we're kind of, clearing our glasses and looking at things clearly, there's probably a lot of wins that we can point to. And sometimes you have to scrub those, or you have to sanitize those stories or whatever, but you have to figure out a way to get credit for those things across the organization, especially to the extent, again, like I said in the start of this conversation, especially to the extent that your job is contingent on that participation from the workforce. Well, what's coming out of that? What fires have you put out? What improvements to the business have you made? I've used this analogy before, but like if there are two houses next door to each other and they were both built at the exact same, the same year, exact same floor plan, one has been updated with brand new, quartz countertops. All the bathrooms have been remodeled, and this one has, all the original shag carpet and the avocado appliances. Which one is going to trade for a higher value? Well, obviously this one. This one is going to have a higher price per square foot. And so professionalizing an organization is akin to increasing the price per square foot of a piece of property. As you improve a piece of property and you invest in it and you remodel things, that price of the per square foot of that property goes up. Every single square inch of that place is worth more. That's the same thing that we're doing as we're de-risking our organizations, as we're putting processes in place, as we're putting functions in place that truly are flexible, that can scale with the organization, and that can sustainably mitigate risk. When we're doing that, the price of our property or the price of our organization is going up. And if that's true, well, then there's a lot of goodness. There's a lot of enterprise value creation from our efforts. We need to have the confidence to say, like, hey, the stuff I'm doing is not pushing papers. I'm not just asking you to fill out forms and do boring trainings. I'm doing this in order to improve our organization and improve the quality of our organization. And in doing that, all else equal, we're increasing the enterprise value. So when we can move from a self-view, a self-image of a cost center to something where we're like, no, we are value creators. We're adding enterprise value every single day in our organization. I think it should give us some more confidence and a new lens, like I said, to find those pieces of, goodness column that you can start shining a light on and getting some credit for.
If I can add something to that, Nick, because I've been in so many situations where a policy says something, and if you just, enforce it blindly, you're going to crush the business, right? I've been in that situation where you can literally put a lot of people out of work, and I've gone back to the people who generated the policy to understand what the original intent, what were you trying to drive, what issue were you trying to to prevent, and you find out often that it has nothing to do with what you're looking at. That wasn't the intent, right? So sometimes a change in the policy, right? These are people who are telling you, look into this. help me out, right? That maybe that policy, the procedure is no longer fit for purpose and it needs to be modified. And unfortunately, in compliance, people say, well, that's the letter of the law. That's what you need to meet. And that's, in my view, that's the biggest mistake that could be made.
All right. Should we talk about this DOJ and integrative audit risk profile?
Yeah, I'll make this really quickly because we touched upon this a little bit better. So I look at it, if you will, this is kind of like a funnel, right? Of when you're trying to profile the organization. DOJ talks, it's very similar to the audit processes that I'm suggesting here, or the evaluation process, what you're looking at from a very high level. It's almost like a waterfall, if you will. You're looking at the governments, what are their priorities? Certain governments are, they're going to have conflict of interest with the regulators. You look at intellectual property in China as an example, right? They want to grow their business. You have intellectual property, you want to do business in China because it's a big, gigantic opportunity. Well, if you're in that business, it's going to be very big risk, because if you get into that situation, it may not be enforced by the regulatory as much, right? So understanding that is important. Now, the regulatory the government influences the regulator, how much resources they're going to get, how much authority they're going to get.
What does this mean, LI? What does LI mean?
Leading indicator.
Got
right?
it.
So when you have that situation, when you have that situation, sorry about that.
Yeah, you're good.
You kind of can start framing that, well, the government, if I go into this area, they're not going to enforce this thing that I'm vulnerable with. And so therefore your risk and controls may need to be a little bit higher. And then that drives the regulatory body. We see in the US that sometimes they don't have the resources to enforce things. And it may be 5 years before they enforce them. In the meantime, that organization has made $5 billion, right? And may get a $100 million fine. So they become a little bit more cowboys, because that influences that risk of the industry. And then the next step is that I would endorse here is looking at the industry in general, right? Because the industry is influenced by the enforcement of that regulatory and that strength that regulatory has. I equate it to very simple, Nick, to seeing cops every corner. And if you do an infraction, they're booting your car or towing your car immediately. Well,
your sounds like Chicago.
Yeah. Your risk appetite for that may be a little low, right? For that industry, or vice versa. So understanding that is important. And then the next piece is the organization that you're dealing in, or your own, is understanding your profile, your business objectives. How aggressive is it compared to the risk? And do you have a rap sheet, right? What's your DNA of that organization? I equate an organization like a family. You got a DNA that you may not want. You have a propensity to do certain things under certain environments. And that cascades, that rap sheet of, whether you're a tax evader or you're continuously on the eye of DOJ, or for many different reasons, that permeates across the DNA, right? Doesn't mean you're going to be doing the same thing, but I can tell you the propensity for that happening under a stressful condition is a lot higher, and it'll repeat itself.
Yeah, I mean, how many cases are there where a company gets in trouble with DOJ for something, and then 8 years later they're in trouble for the exact same thing? Like, if you're not fixing that root DNA issue, then that's a risk that needs to be on the radar. So David had a really good question here. He said, our organization is going through significant change with a new majority owner coming in, or a new majority coming onto the board and having a new CEO. How can we best use this opportunity? I love that word. How can we best use this opportunity as a catalyst for risk culture development? What would you say to that, Julio? Because, anytime there's change, there's always an opportunity. Anytime there's movement, there's always an opportunity to get a little bit more land, to reframe what you're doing, right? Like, how would you utilize this opportunity of a new majority coming in, a new CEO, to kind of
I live
to take advantage of this? Yeah.
I live for that opportunity, because usually these people want a lay of the land. They're not owners of all the problems that happened in the past, right? So they're more open to see the warts, if you will, of the business.
Yeah, the
right?
fresh eyes, they're bringing fresh eyes to it.
That's exactly it. So this is an incredible opportunity to put all that dirt that may have existed underneath the carpet and say, hey, these are the issues we've been having. These are the obstacles that we have to help you drive the business. It doesn't have to, we don't have to have those risks, and providing that data, that will make them make informed decisions about how to capitalize, right? Risk and reward are two sides of the same coin, right? You can actually turn that around and say, we don't have to have these obstacles anymore. Here's all the data that we have. This is what leading companies are doing in that space.
I think that's right. And I would also kind of add, you have to frame it in a way of what matters to them. So what is the new majority? Is it a private equity fund? What kind of a fund is it? Can you look at what other investments they've done? What kind of an angle that they take? How can you speak? How can you speak their language? And just keep in mind this concept of a Sharpe ratio. So Sharpe ratio is it's a ratio in finance where it takes the expected return of an investment and divides that by the standard deviation of that return. That's the variability of that return. That's the risk. So all else equal, we always want a higher Sharpe ratio, right? The same return if one has a really high variability versus one that has a really low variability, you're always going to want the one with the less risk. So think about ways that you can talk about this is an investment. If a new majority is coming in, if it's CEO's coming in, he probably has some kind of options in the company. He wants to see that enterprise value expand. So how can you frame out the impact that you're having or the risks that are super important in your mind to a threat to that enterprise value that they're trying to preserve and trying to grow? But I think I think, David, the way you asked the question was right, because it is an opportunity. There's always an opportunity when there's fresh eyes coming into something and there's, a shifting of power to really align yourself with that new power structure by showing that you are aligned with what they care most about. All right, let's keep moving here. This is a phenomenal conversation. Okay. Go ahead, Julio. Go ahead and add on to that if you want.
Understanding, this is why I say that like the top tier profiling of the company and understanding, their objectives, what they want to do, what markets they want to grow in and what new products or what new services they want to grow in. It's really critical to understand that, right? Because that's going to help you deliver the controls that you should be prioritizing on it and sell that case. Hey, we can shift some of these resources from where we were prioritizing before, and we can do this and perhaps doing it in a very cost-effective way. So moving on, we're going into a little bit of a solution, if you will. So from leading companies, this is kind of a hybrid. I would suggest you'd even modify into what your needs are, but this is a high-level thought process, if you will. Leading companies that I've worked with, multinational, even small companies, that are consistent across the organization, they'll use what they simply call the trace matrix. It may be a very overly simplified, but it could be a GRC database where you're actually putting in the actual regulation, the actual, if you will, the law of what the requirements are, and you're putting it simply on a column, if I can simplify it here. And then the second column would be, what is the intent of that law, that regulation? What are they really trying to drive? And do we have information about what that would look like? Because people make a lot of mistakes misinterpreting what the regulations or the code of regulations may say, because there's biases in there, right? And then so that forces people to look at what are they really trying to drive and prevent? And what industry knowledge do we have about that intent? And bring your subject matter experts in that to help you define that. That's a very big mistake that I see often. And then from a trace matrix perspective, it would be the next step would be to look at the column would be, well, where do we have that information, those requirements and that intent in our procedures and our policy and our internal controls, right? Simply no judgment, just where do we have it? And then the next step is, again, no judgment. What are the gaps and how big are they? So that's a trace matrix where you're actually saying, hey, it's in policy, procedure X, Y, and Z, a simple gap analysis of what the differences are. And then you're getting into the next stage. What I would recommend is, what is the big effect? What's the so what? The fact that we have this gap could be trivial, right? It could be just a minor change into your policies. Or it could be, oh my God, I need a whole new facility. We'd never be able, and I've been in that situation, Nick, where the risks were so high, the regulations were so demanding, and I'm like, there's no way you're going to be able to meet these requirements consistently. And unless you build a new facility, we can't approve you, right? Because you're never going to be able to get this right. So they went back and they evaluated that level of risk, to move forward on that. And then the, evaluating the effect. Now there's there's, and I'll talk a little bit about this because I think this is important to the subject. I wasn't going to talk about it, but I think it's important to the subjects that you brought about. How do we become a little more proactive, right? So leading organizations will say, okay, yeah, we can do investigations and events, but how about if we actually identify the leading indicators of what might happen, what that would look like, right, before it actually happens? So in our field, we call them atypical results because maybe the requirement is X and you're just a quarter of an inch, a hair from not meeting a requirement, right? So that's an atypical result that you may want to evaluate, maybe not a big, gigantic investigation, but you may want to keep an eye on that as those patterns start to emerge. Patterns that you start seeing, instead of getting one investigation every month, you're getting 10. Well, that's a trigger that you should be, in most leading industries, they'll say that's a trigger. Maybe they're all 10 minor, but what's going on? And they would evaluate that before it becomes an event. So that's very atypical. That's very good practice. And those companies, their attention is on those small stuff. They're not putting out fires. They're trying to improve the business, and it's magic to see that sort of, that consistency across organizations. So I hope I answered that piece. So the takeaways here, just the refresh, right? There's a lot of things in the news constantly. Recently, McKinsey and TD Bank. When I look at those type of events, I look at the profiling that we talked about, right? Very upfront, very way back, and if you will, at the strategic level, right? That the symptoms that what you may be seeing in the local investigations are a result of what happened upstream. So right. That person or that entity has to have the authority and the independence to kind of look upstream and call out the balls and strikes in an uncomfortable situation to do that. And that's a struggle for most companies to do that. Usually the operational people don't have that level of authority if they want to keep their job sometimes. So that's a vulnerable situation. And then this integrative approach, if you will, using risk and using a quantitative risk and internal insights, that really forces you to do a business alignment. Because one of the slides that we might have kind of gone over, it was called the FMEA. If I can back up on that, when you do this FMEA, where you're looking at the so what and what's the probability of it occurring and what's the severity of it, right? And could we detect it if it happened? Could we prevent it if it were to happen, right? That's that table, right? So those fields were, as you identify the effect of what could happen, the big things, then you ask yourself, how big of an event is it? And then what's the probability that our systems, if it happened, that we could prevent it from happening, right? You give it a score 1 to 10. You're actually trying to quantify based on the data that you have. And then you get into what I call the proactive piece, which is detectability. How robust are your systems to detect something if it were to happen? How good are they at identifying the things that are leading indicators or not yet events? And when you're in that zone, you're able to pick that up and evaluate those things. You can prevent those issues from happening. That's a great space. So it puts you in that space. It's this process is that I'm suggesting here that pulls a lot of pieces together. It's an uncannily predictive, because it's also going to give you an opportunity, Nick, not just to say backward looking, hey, this compliance issue happened, but you're actually giving the opportunity to people to say what needed to be in place to prevent that. Right. And that's your root causes. And if you have enough of them, you can make those changes to prevent it. So that's really important. And then the cultural, it really improves the culture of the organization because they know what their boundaries are, that what the company's willing to accept and promote.
So round of applause for Julio. This was phenomenal. A lot of great comments in the chat. A couple extra questions we weren't able to get to. So sorry about that, but I hope that you guys enjoyed this session, and I hope you enjoyed this year on the Ethicsverse. We try every single week to provide great content to this community that's so critical for the integrity of our organizations. Our community has grown so much this year, and I'm really excited for next year. We got some real exciting things coming down the pike. So there's no Ethicsverse until after the first of the year. So I'll see you all next year. Hope you have a safe, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. And one more round of applause for the run in Only Julio. Of course, Ethicsverse members are going to get all these slides. And yeah, hope you guys have a great couple of weeks, and we'll see you soon. See you next year.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nick. Appreciate it.
Yeah, man.